Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchangified. So, exam 2, quiz and assignments part 3, deadline April 4th, start 5th. Probably of the day. And exam 3, exam 4, quiz and assignments part 4, April 26th. Both dates are Fridays, and of course, end of the day, 11 to 9 to 9 p.m. Exam 5, the assignment final covering all things. Deadline's a Wednesday, or finals week at 5 p.m. As mentioned on previous occasions, to see if you actually need the final, the thing to do is once you've done 4 exams, as many quiz and assignments as you wish to do, then get the grade estimator and plug in 100% for exam 5 and see if that improves your overall grade by letter grade or more. And of course, if you already have the A without the final, then doing the final wouldn't do anything because you would already be in an A. And as mentioned before, the overall grade you see on there assumes a 0 on all the stuff you haven't done, and it auto zeros those, and of course as you do them, replaces them with a real grade. So at the end of the semester, I don't have to go and do any dropping or subtracting or stuff. Blackboard does it all for me. As mentioned before, I had a meeting with the provost today, not me personally of course, just I guess everybody down at the Charles Horner Theater. So if you like meetings, we'll be there from 2 to 3-ish in Charles Horner Theater at 2 o'clock today. Before pressing on to our new stuff, namely induction, any stuff about previous stuff, or stuff to be, or stuff, that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we began our adventures in inductive reasoning. As we saw back in those ancient days of before time, inductive arguments are arguments, so every one of them's got a conclusion and one or more premises. And we saw that unlike deduction, so we kind of have this branching line of argument, argument or not, and then you get into inductive and deductive, and then with the inductive, they're going to be either strong or weak. Although it's really not a branching thing, it's more of a gradient, ranging from like really super strong all the way down to super weak. And as I mentioned before, for every inductive argument, kind of the downside is you have to learn like different standards for every inductive argument. Whereas the deductive arguments, you just do it for each type of logic. So as we'll see in the future with categorical logic, we just learn the Venn diagram or rules meant for testing. With true functional logic, it's truth tables or proofs, and every argument gets assessed by the same methods. So every deductive argument is true functional. There's just one set of rules. But every inductive argument gets its own set of standards. And to use an analogy I've used before, inductive arguments are kind of like performance competitions, like Olympic figure skating or Olympic dressage, which thanks to Mitt Romney running, I know is horse dancing. It's a thing. It's a sport. And he owns like a dancing horse. That was a while ago though, so maybe dancing horse is departed, but maybe not. He's sad to think the horse departed. At least if it died dancing, it would die happy. So, anyways, so if you're judging, say you're an Olympic judge, and you're judging figure skating, and you're judging dressage, you're an all-around judge, you have the same basic things, it's got to be a good performance, and the idea is whichever performs better is the winner. But of course, there are different standards for ice dancing and horse dancing. And inductive arguments are similar. They all have a basic standard, they got to be strong, and try not to be weak, but each one of the particular standards, particular things you'll look for. Which is kind of a downside, because again, for every inductive argument, you got to learn new standards. Now, as you saw, the definition of inductive arguments is this. Again, they're arguments, so everyone's got one conclusion and possibly multiple premises that support the conclusion. What makes them what they are, though, is that logic part, the inductive part. And going with the bridge metaphor, deductive arguments are either perfect, flawless bridges that guarantee passage across, or they are broken ruins in which they're terrible. Deductive arguments have that binary property, perfect, broken. Inductive arguments, though, come in degrees of strength. They're kind of like bridges in the real world. They range from being like super strong, like the Brooklyn Bridge, or pretty weak, like a rickety wooden bridge on ropes across a vast chasm. Now, that support being partial means that inductive arguments, again, can never be valid, they can never be sound. And the reason why they have that property is because inductive arguments always involve making a leap from what you've observed to what you know to what you don't. And any time you make a jump in the dark, there's always a chance you're not going to make it, because it's a jump. Even if the gap is really small, metaphorically speaking, one must always mind that gap because, you know, like you've perhaps seen on YouTube videos, even a small obstacle can cause people to, or animals to, fall and collapse. So because of that, we can always go wrong with inductive arguments. So as we saw before, why do we use them? And the answer is because we got them. Because most things in life are inductive, if only for very practical reasons. So to use a quick illustration, we have another election coming up in 2020, and for some it's like, yay, a chance for new stuff, and for others it's, oh God, not another election, and maybe a little both. And of course they're already cranking out surveys to see what people think of the various candidates, and the only way we could have a perfect picture would be to survey every single voter in the US, which would cost vast amounts of money and huge amounts of time. And of course, since it's so far ahead of the election, it could still be messed up because people can still change their mind. So what we do is we pull a small sample, and we can always go wrong. As we saw in the 2016 election, all the surveys showed Hillary as our next president, but of course that turned out to be not the case. So, strong arguments, the premises provide powerful support for the conclusion. So if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true. A weak one is such that the support provided by the premises is not enough. And as I mentioned last time, there would be like the most strong an argument could be, which would be like 99.9 to infinity, because it can never be 100%, otherwise it would be deductive. And that would be the strongest inductive argument is all, just shy of perfection. And of course 0 would be the weakest, and in here is the gray zone. And there is a question about at what point is stronger, and we'll see how that plays out. Now, some more concepts. The first one is this. There is the strength of the argument, but there's also the strength or probability of the conclusion, which are separate things. And this will seem like a technical point, because it is, but it's actually relevant and kind of important. Suppose we have two inductive arguments. One is Sally bought 1 lottery ticket. Conclusion, Sally will win. The second argument is Sally bought 10 lottery tickets. Sally will win. Now, these, of course, are both, in terms of the premise supporting the conclusion, they're both pretty weak. Because think of like a lottery. Suppose, you go to work or class and Sally's there and Sally says, looking forward to quitting my job and living the rich lifestyle, the rich and famous. You say, how, Sally, what is your plan? She says, look at this, 1 lottery ticket, guaranteed. Now, would that be smart of Sally to quit her job at that point with that 1 lottery ticket? No, because the chance of winning is 1 in millions, perhaps billions. So pretty incredibly weak argument. In fact, the odds of being right, 1 in millions. Now suppose she says, okay, I get it, 1's not enough. She says, look at this, 10 lottery tickets. Wealth is assured. Now in that case, it's a stronger argument because her chance of winning just increased by 10 times. She went from 1 in a billion to 10 in a billion. But is that a strong argument though? Should she quit her job after buying those 10 tickets? No, because the odds are still incredibly low. Now in terms of strength, they're both, if you're looking at them in terms of just sort of in general, they're both really weak. And, because we can calculate the probabilities. So if there is, say, 1 billion tickets being sold, to exaggerate, 1 in a billion, 10 in a billion. So they're both incredibly, they're both really weak arguments. But in terms of the relative strength, and relative strength is how do they compare to each other. And this one is a relatively stronger argument because if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true than in this argument, because this provides more support than that. So the strength of the argument is a measure of the logic. And so you could have arguments that are all pretty weak, but one could be stronger. To use a metaphor, relative strength of arguments is like relative strength of people. You could have, people who are really, really weak, and if one person can lift, 10 pounds, the other person can only lift 1 pound. Yeah, a person who can only lift 10 pounds is pretty weak, but they are relatively stronger than someone who can only lift 1 pound. So the strength of the argument has nothing to do with its, truth of the conclusion directly. It's that how likely it is that if the premises are true, the conclusion will be true. It's a function of the logic. And again, we compare arguments to each other. One argument is stronger than another. And we can also, again, kind of speak in general terms, like, yeah, this is really weak, and this is less weak, but still pretty weak. Now, what about the probability of the conclusion? Well, the probability of the conclusion is a separate thing. That is the likelihood the conclusion is true just on its own. So it wouldn't be a matter of the quality of the logic, it's just, is that conclusion probably true? And you would not assess it in terms of an argument. So, in the case of these two arguments, this one is stronger. In other words, if she, to illustrate, if she bought 10 tickets, she's more likely to win than she bought 1. So, stronger argument. Now, the probability of the conclusion being true is just that. It is, what is the likelihood that that conclusion is going to be correct? Now, in assessing that, there's a thing that people use in philosophy and sciences called the principle of total evidence, which of course we usually can't meet because it's probably impossible, but here's the idea. When you're assessing the probability of a claim being true, what you have to do is use all the evidence. More realistically, all the available evidence. And there's a fallacy, which the book doesn't cover, in which people don't do this, where they do the probability based on not all the evidence. But the principle of total evidence is this. If the question is that true, you would need to consider all the available evidence. Because the question is that true? So will Sally win? Now, of course, you consider as part of your evidence, like how many tickets she bought, etc. But the question would be, is that true? Now, this is separate from the question of, is the argument strong? Because when you assess whether the argument's strong or not, the question is not, is the conclusion true, or what is the probability the conclusion is true? The question is, given just these premises, what is the probability the conclusion is true? So, if we go with assessing this first argument, she bought 1 ticket, and this argument is very, very, very weak. Now, suppose we find out later on that Sally's pretty clever, and she's hacked into the lottery system and is guaranteed that she's going to win. Now, in that case, what is the probability she'll win? Yeah, 100%, unless she gets caught. But her argument is unaffected, because the original argument is this argument. It is, Sally bought 1 ticket, Sally will win, and this argument by itself would be very, very weak, because given this is very improbable. But someone might say, but wait, we now know she's a super hacker, and she hacked it to win. Doesn't that change this argument? And the answer is, no, it doesn't change this argument, but it changes the probability of the conclusion. To use a terrible analogy, think of like in track. If you ever did track, familiar with track, with the short sprinting events, they often do like, heats. So you run not just once for a time, multiple things. And so if a person runs, say, a quarter mile, and they're kind of hurt and tired, and they run like 74 seconds, and you look at that time and say, oh, that's not great for college time, and then but their PR is like 45 seconds. Well, yeah, true, they are a really fast runner, but that time in that quarter is not going to be faster because you assess that based on this. Like if the person said, well, I've run a 45 quarter, shouldn't I get first place in this one? Well, no, you assess it based on what happened there. So it's not a question of is this true, it's a question of, given this evidence, what's the probability this is true? So to recap the difference, the probability of the conclusion being true is given all the evidence that you can have. You take into account all the available evidence, is that claim true, probably true or not? The other question is, given just this argument, is that conclusion probably true or not? And they're separate things. Now again, someone might say, but I know this. I know she's hacking the lottery, so that's got to be true. Well, yeah, true. The claim is true, but the argument itself is not changed. This argument is still pretty weak. She bought one. All we have is she bought one ticket. There are billions of people playing. That she'll win would be unlikely. To use a final analogy, it's kind of like in a legal court. There is what we know about a person, and then there's what they can prove in court. So, for example, imagine somebody who's really arrogant, and they're put on trial, and they present the evidence, but the evidence is not enough to convince the juror, the available evidence. And reasonably so. You look at the evidence, you're like, yeah, I know the person did it, but all the available evidence doesn't support it, not enough for beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the person gets out of jail, and they know double jeopardy, so they said, I totally did it. I totally did all those financial crimes. And I've already been tried, so there's nothing you can do. Now in that case, we know it's true, but does that suddenly change the argument? Well, no, because during the trial, we can only go by the available evidence, and it wasn't enough to support the conclusion. So even if we later know the person did it, yeah, now we know they're guilty, but the argument doesn't change. You couldn't go back and say to the prosecutor, your stupid argument, you should have had that in there. Well, that wouldn't be fair, because that's all they had. So there's the quality of the argument, and then there's, is the conclusion true or not? And again, the legal analogy is pretty good, because there's often what we know about people, and then there's what we actually have to use in court, admissible evidence. And of course, there are plenty of cases where we know people are super guilty, but it's just don't have the evidence for it. And so that's the difference between knowing or pretty sure a claim is true, but not being able to actually prove it logically. So we need to separate out, is the conclusion true, from does this evidence support this claim? Now, one thing that comes up when talking about inductive arguments, but before moving on to that, anything about that, like the difference between conclusion being true and the strength of the argument, that needs any more stuff. And again, it's very important in the legal sense, because I remember when I get called in a jury duty quite often, they always do kind of make this point in legal talk. Like, you can't go based on what kind of things you think or might even know. You have to go based on what they provide. So even if you knew they were actually like guilty, weirdly the question is not do you know that, the question is is the case actually made. Now, back in the ancient days when I was a student, when I learned about inductive arguments, one of the things that went on the list of what they were was this. With deductive arguments, adding additional information doesn't improve them. For example, if we have the Tuesday-Wednesday argument, if today is Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday, today's Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday, adding more info won't make that better, because it's already 100%. And sort of the old way of teaching inductive arguments was, if you add more information, that would make the argument stronger. Which on one hand is true, on the other hand, not true. And here's how. So the way I was taught it all those ancient years ago would be like kind of in this example. So you've got the initial argument, Sally bought one ticket, Sally will win. Weak argument. But with inductive arguments, the way they would say it is, adding more information would make the argument better. So the more information you had, the stronger the argument would be. And again, one hand, true, other hand, not. It's very technical and abstract, but here's how it goes. So suppose we were put in that she hacked the system. Now in that case, that would make the argument stronger. And so the additional information, Sally bought one ticket, but she hacked the system, so she doesn't win a ticket, so she wins. That would be a much stronger argument. Now the authors of the book point out correctly, but also in a very sort of technical point, this thing. The original argument, of course, doesn't get any better, because the original argument is this one. Sally bought one ticket, Sally will win. Now if we find out that Sally hacked the process, then we get a new argument, which would be Sally bought one ticket, to Sally hacked, conclusion, Sally will win. So now we have two arguments, and of course this one is much stronger. But the original argument is unchanged. It doesn't like go back and make the original argument stronger, because the original argument is still the original argument. Now, on one hand, this is like a technicality, because someone could say, yeah, okay, I get it. Here's the original argument, and if you add a new premise, it's not the same argument. You get a new argument, and it's stronger. But that's all, pretty technical. And that would be kind of a fair point, because it could be seen as kind of quibbling about, that being in there. But to be fair to the quibbling, they are different arguments. So if I make this argument, and then I get a new additional premise, I've got a new argument. Two analogies. One is like with an essay test. If you do an essay test and turn it in, and you leave something out, and then later on in the semester you do the test with the same question, you put it in, yeah, this one will get a better grade, but it doesn't go back and change your original grade. That's still the original answer is still what it is. Sure, now you have this, but this one is still what it was before. Doesn't change that. Or to use a track analogy, if someone runs then they run a really bad 5K, like 45 minutes or something, and then they go and run, and the next one, they run really well, they run like a 17-minute 5K. Yeah, true, they ran a really good 5K this time, maybe on the same course, but it doesn't go back and change their previous one. It's not like they go back and say, okay, retroactively you win this one because you ran well here. I mean, true, they are on the same course, 5K, etc., but what happens now doesn't affect what happened before. So again, it's kind of a quibbly point. If you add more premises, you get a new argument, or new arguments, the old one stays the same. So again, kind of quibbly, but also, I guess, kind of important. Before pressing on, anything about the quibbling that needs more quibble, or kibble? So now we see our first exciting inductive argument. It is known as the statistical syllogism, combining all the things people love: statistics, syllogisms, logic. Now it's a pretty straightforward argument. It's got two premises and a conclusion, which is why it's called a syllogism. A syllogism is just a fancy term for an argument with one conclusion, of course, and two premises. So if something is presented as a syllogism, and the person is wording their words correctly, it's got a conclusion, two premises, because by definition. It's kind of like a tricycle. If someone's got a tricycle and they know what the word means, it's got 3 wheels. Like a bicycle, 2 wheels. Now, the authors present this as also going from the general to the specific. And the reason why is this. Outside of philosophy, it's common to define deduction and induction as going from general to specific, or specific to general. And in other fields, again, if you're taking a test in a class and they're like, this is the right answer, go with that. But in terms of the logic, it doesn't have anything to do with whether you're going general to specific or specific to general, because what matters is the way the reasoning works. Total support making it deductive, partial support making it inductive. So as we'll see, with inductive arguments, you can go from the general to the specific, or the specific to the general. And the authors, I seem to take that really personally because they really like to make that point. So our first one is the inductive / statistical syllogism, which is this. Premise 1. Such and such, like percentage of x's or y's, like 70% of media journalists are liberals, or 80% of Americans favor background checks, or whatever you're talking about. Then you'd say this is a X, like a teacher or journalist or American, therefore it has that property. So, as a full example, 80% of Americans favor federal background checks. This is an American, they favor federal background checks. Or, 90% of journalists are liberals. Anderson is a journalist, Anderson is liberal. And again, you can plug in anything in here. Now, in everyday life, of course, people don't talk like premise 1. 90% of journalists are liberal. Premise 2, Anderson is a journalist. Conclusion, Anderson is liberal. People in the real world, of course, generally don't talk like that. So in normal life, you might have to, kind of put things together. Someone might say, yeah, most of those journalists are liberals, so Anderson is clearly a liberal. Leaving out, that Anderson is a journalist, and leaving out like all the premise conclusion thing. So we often have to reconstruct stuff. So how do you tell when you've got a good one of these, and why do people use them? Well, this is often something we do pretty automatically. We have built into our background information, typically like membership in groups of things. For example, and it also can kind of tie in stereotypes. So for example, if you're out like in a park, you see a golden retriever off in the distance, you're probably not too worried, because most golden retrievers are nice. That's a golden retriever, it's probably nice. If you see like a mountain lion, when you're in the park, kind of off in the distance, you're probably more worried. It could be a really nice mountain lion. It just wants to be your friend, hang out, maybe do some Sudoku or something. That's still a thing. Maybe it isn't. But statistically speaking, it probably wants to bite you. And so you probably want to stay away from it. And so we engage in this in a way often very subconsciously. We assess things for, danger, for, gain, etc., based on this. So again, even when you're just walking along, you're making all kinds of estimates about whether something's in a category or not. And in many cases, even though we don't consciously think this, we're kind of like putting it into like danger, not danger, character, boxes based on percentages. And when you make judgments about people, about terms of their abilities, etc., it often rests on these. And of course, it could be totally mistaken. We could be wrong about the qualities, but that's what we do. And of course, sometimes they do it very, very consciously, where we decide whether somebody or something belongs in a category based on what we think the percentages are. So how do we tell when you got a good one? So if we're making choices about putting people or things into these categories, how do we know when we're doing it reasonably? Well, one thing, of course, that goes beyond just the logic is, of course, is that true? And we also need to ask, of course, is that true? Are we characterizing them correctly? And sometimes people's percentages are off about whether things are dangerous or good or capable or competent or not. Now, fortunately, the assessment is super simple. In fact, there's only one standard we need in terms of assessing the logic, which is this. It's a straightforward, higher the percentage of x's that are y's, the stronger the argument. Which makes sense, because the more x's that are y's, the higher the probability that this x is a y. So for example, again, we can play, safe, not safe. if you're walking through the park and you see a golden retriever, guessing I'm saying probably 95% of golden retrievers, or maybe 99%, don't just randomly attack people. And so if you're playing safe, not safe, that's a really strong argument. I mean, you could be wrong. This could be like, you know, Sasha, the murderous golden, with an incredible body count, just roams parks, you know, murdering people. But statistically speaking, probably not super much to worry about. Likewise, if you see like a mountain lion, you know, when you're out hiking, they don't always attack people, but they are, you know, pretty dangerous, so probably not your friend. So they're probably like a 99% not friendly creature. And so that would be a really strong argument as well, which is why people aren't too afraid of golden retrievers, but they're rightfully wary of things like mountain lions. So the more x's that are y's, the better the argument. Now, and this is where the probability of the conclusion becomes a factor. Because if you're doing a statistical syllogism, this is all you get. You just get percentage, this is an x, therefore this is a y. But of course, when we're trying to decide if this is a y or not, we would throw in all kinds of other additional information. For example, here would be the statistical syllogism of safe, not safe, walking the park. So walking along, spot golden retriever. You know that the vast majority of golden retrievers are not dangerous, that's a golden, not dangerous. And that would be a very strong statistical syllogism. Now, of course, you could start throwing in additional information. For example, if you see the golden is with a family with kids, and you see it playing nicely with the kids, it makes it even less likely it's a murder hound, far less likely. Or if you see it's all by itself, and you look and you notice that, you know, it's got blood all over its face, it's wearing like an anarchist t-shirt or something, then you would think that would increase the probability that it is murder hound. But of course, the original argument stays the same because it doesn't have, you know, slots to put in like extra stuff. So the argument itself, the original one, would just be this. But then of course, when we're wondering about, is this true, then we could put in additional stuff. But it wouldn't be this argument, it would be like new assessment. Now this is not saying that you shouldn't bring in additional information, because if you just stuck with this and didn't adjust based on additional information, you can make a lot of bad choices. But the original argument is just this. And then there's the other question of not just, you know, is this a good argument, but there's also the question of, is this true, which is a separate point. So this is kind of the beginning of the reasoning, and then you'd go to refine it with other evidence. Okay, so that's the statistical syllogism. Here's the form, certain percentage of x's or y's, this is an x, this is y. How do you know if it's good, bad, or ugly? Well, higher the percentage of x's that are y's, stronger the argument, lower the weaker. Now again, if you're wondering, is this x or y, then as part of the process of thinking about it, you might throw in additional information, but you're making new arguments. The original one stands on its own. Before pressing on from this, anything about this, or murder hounds, that needs any more stuff. Now, one inductive argument we'll be seeing every single day. If you can't avoid politics, you'll see this, you know, constantly once we start getting into the election cycle, because this is what is used to create polls. So if you're wondering, like, what is the logical engine behind surveys and polls, and here's the answer: the inductive generalization. And as I mentioned, you know, it's super common, especially around election time, because this is what powers polling, at least in terms of the logic. It's the Russians and the other parts. Now in this case, we're going from something specific to the general. So instead of going from, like, most golden retrievers are not murder hounds, this is a golden, this is not a murder hound, we're going from a small sample and expanding it to everything. So making the leap. So what we're trying to do is this. In the statistical syllogism, we already know what percentage of x's or y's. Like, we know that, for example, 90% of journalists are liberal. Anderson's a journalist, Anderson is liberal. Now, in the case of the inductive generalization, we don't know what percentage of X's or Y's. That's what we want to know. So we're wondering what percentage of journalists are liberal, or what percentage of voters would back the Starbucks CEO, or what percentage of voters are going to vote for Trump again, or what percentage of voters support Biden versus Warren versus the 7,000 other Democrats who are running. I think it's 7,000, is that right? 7,002 maybe. So how do we do that? Well, shockingly simple. We only have one premise and, of course, a conclusion. So building an inductive generalization is as simple as arguments could get, but they're super powerful. So here's how we build one. First is this: a certain percentage of observed X's or Y's. So we say, for example, observe that, I don't know, 60% of Democrats say they'll back Elizabeth Warren, or 90% of Republicans say they'll back Donald Trump, whatever we're getting. Then what we do is we draw the conclusion from our observation that this applies to the whole population we're concerned with. So, drawn out, it would look like this. So what we need is, of course, our sample, and the sample is extracted from our entire target population, sometimes known as target class, sometimes known as the target, or in pseudo-French, the target. Then what we do is this. So we get our population. Now, of course, we have to identify our population because depending on who or what we're concerned with, we'll have different, populations we're worried about. So to give, a quick illustration. If we're wondering about, say, the general election, we'd be concerned with all voters because they all get to vote. If we're concerned with the primaries coming up, we'd be mostly concerned with Democrats, for the Democratic primaries, and Republicans for the Republican primary. So, for example, in most states, or many states, like Florida, for example, we have closed primaries. So if you're a Republican, you vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democrat primary. And if you're independent, you're basically screwed, because you just have to wait to see whatever chumps the Democrats and Republicans put up for you to decide between. So, pretty rough system, but intentionally so to maintain political power for the Democrats and Republicans. So if we were concerned about the upcoming primaries, our target would not be all voters, our target would be Democrats or Republicans, because that's all the only people who can vote for the primaries in Florida. If we're wondering about the general election, we'd go with everybody, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. So here's how we do it, to illustrate the generalization. So in this case, we're concerned with a particular property. In this case, the Y. In the example of voting, it'd be how people would vote. So for example, suppose you're working for Elizabeth Warren as her team, and you're trying to see how she'd do in Florida. So what you do is you're looking at, say, initially the primary voters. So you pull a sample of Florida Democrats, and you would see what percentage of them would support Warren. So you might ask them, would you support Warren? Or you may make a more complicated survey with all the Democrats that are running now, all 7,002, and ask them to pick which one they would support. That'd probably be a better approach because it would give you a better picture. And suppose you find that 60% say they would back Elizabeth Warren, just hypothetically. So in your sample, you've got the result, 60% will back Warren. So then what you do, and here's where the generalization goes. You take your sample and you generalize it to the whole population. So you'd say that 60% of Democratic voters in Florida would vote for Elizabeth Warren. Now, if that were actually the case, you'd probably call her up and say, go for it. You're gonna win the primary, probably. Now, since it's inductive, this could all go terribly wrong, because there's all kinds of factors that can affect this. People may later change their minds. There's a lot of time between now and then. It may be by chance, just by pure chance, you pulled a lot of people who really like Elizabeth Warren. So it may be that the real percentage is way lower, but you just happen by pure luck, or good or bad, you managed to get a bunch of Warren supporters just by chance. So this could be perfectly accurate, but this could be, it could be off because of all those factors. Because you're pulling out a small sample from a big group. Now, if you were going for the general election, you'd want to sample not just Democrats, but everybody. So you'd ask them, in the general election, would you vote for Elizabeth Warren? And suppose you get 52% people say yeah, and you project that back on the whole population. And you probably say to Elizabeth, yeah, you should probably win. Get a decent chance of not losing. So, quick recap. Inductive generalization is when you pull a sample, observe your sample for the quality you're concerned with. In this case, it would be, say, voting. To use another illustration, it's also a model for quality control production lines. You pull out like sample iPhones, computers, shoes, whatever, and you check them for defects. So you'd say if you find like a 1% defect rate in your sample, you would say the whole production run has about a 1% defect rate. Or if you're polling people like in your class, what they think about the availability of parking, you ask them and project it on like all FAMU students, for example. And so the model's always this. Pull a sample, observe it, extend it back. And so the parts are target population, target class, the population you want to know about, which can be different for different purposes. Your sample is what you pull out, and the feature you're concerned with is the Y part. Before pressing on with more technicalities, anything about that or badly drawn circles that needs more stuff? It's actually improved. My circle used to be worse, but I've taken an extensive course in circle drawing. Still not perfect. I really need one of those big compasses like they used to have in the math stuff. Now, in some cases, we can run into problems with, to go back to the ancient days of part one, with things like vagueness and ambiguity. So, for example, suppose we were wondering what percentage of the population is rich, or what percentage of the population is poor. Now, the term rich and the term poor are pretty vague. And again, it would be a line drawing fallacy to say we have to exactly specify it, because we don't have a perfect definition where we'd say, yes, if you had $1 more, you'd be rich, or 1 more penny. But we have a pretty good idea. We know, for example, that Jeff Bezos is rich. We know that Bill Gates is rich. We know that, unless it's a hidden billionaire here, we know that we're not. And so we have a rough idea. Rich is having lots of money, poor is having, barely. Now, when we're doing a survey, though, or trying to do a sample, we need something more specific than just kind of feeling rich and feeling poor. So we have to specify what's called a sampling frame. In a sampling frame, what we do, also going back to part one, is we make a precising definition. So again, terms like rich, poor, young, old, they're pretty vague and very relative. So if you take like young, it's a very relative term. If you go with like the whole population, then being 45 is not young. But if you look at, say, presidential politics, 45 is pretty young. If you look at sports, 45 is ancient, practically dead. So, yeah, depending on what your purpose is, you would need to refine that frame. So again, the solution is sampling frame, where essentially you take a precise definition and you'd say, for the purpose of your sampling, what you mean by rich or poor. And of course, since you have to do sampling, you would specify a dollar amount. And people who do this, properly, they would always include, we are defining rich as X number of dollars in income. Poor is, Y amount of income. Or young versus old, they would say we consider old to be, 50. Young to be, 30 or under, middle age, middle, defining all that stuff. And so you want to define your friends. Now it's fair to do that because if you're specifying it, people know what you mean. They may say, someone who's 50 may say, I'm not old, I feel young. And yeah, they can make that argument that 50 is not old, but as long as they identify it, what they're saying is, we're defining it this way, and someone could argue about the definition, but they're specifying it. At least they know what the friends mean. So if we were wondering, what do young people think about, Elizabeth Warren, we need to define young. And we may do 30 or under, maybe that's young. Or since we're doing voting, got to be at least 18, but we may do like 18 to 20, depending on what we mean by young. Similarly for the old, if we're wondering like what do old people think about Elizabeth Warren, we would need to specify what we mean by old. Is it like sports old, which would be like 30, or is it like old general, which would be like, I guess, 50-ish, or what do we mean? But the idea is once we specify it, then we can do our sampling. So if we wonder, again, like what do rich people think about Elizabeth Warren, we define what it is to be rich. What do poor people think about Elizabeth Warren, we define what it is to be poor, and then we run our sample, and if we're doing it properly, we include in our description, by rich I mean, by poor I mean, so people know what we mean, so they don't get trapped in that vagueness. And this can get really complicated. If you follow the Facebook marketing, etc., big data, they have all kinds of, as you might imagine, separate frames to get all that fine data to sell crap. And in a way, this is sort of what underlies that whole big data thing. You're trying to get data about observations to figure out what the populations are like. And that way you can do things to influence the population. Manipulate elections, sell shoes, etc. And oddly enough, it comes down to this very simple bit of reasoning, which is shockingly powerful given how simple it is. And many of the business models today are about this, just gathering, scooping up all kinds of data, basically classifying it into different categories, and then using it to basically sell stuff. Before pressing on though, anything about this that needs more stuff? A slight modification, it could be like an old-time bicycle. Such an artistic talent. So how do we tell when you got a good one of these? Well, even though, again, this is super powerful stuff, it underlies big data gathering, polling, etc., the assessment is shockingly simple, at least the basics of it. And here is the assessment. The strength of the argument depends entirely on how well your sample is like or resembles your population. So the more this is like this, the stronger your argument gets. The less this is like this, the weaker your argument gets. So the mission objective in making generalizations is good sampling, to get a good sample that represents your target. Which is why when, say, news agencies want to do their polling, if they're doing their job properly, they're trying to get good samples. In companies that deal in data, they also want to get good samples as well, because bad samples mean bad data. They can't put faith into it. So the objective is to get a representative sample. What does that mean? Well, a sample is representative means pretty much what it says. It looks like the population. So, for example, if the population is 51% women, 49% males, then you'd want your sample to be like that. So ideally, you want the demographics of your sample to exactly match the demographics of your population. Now, in some cases, we have that information. Again, for example, if you're trying to figure out, how voters are going to vote, you don't want your sample to be 70% male, unless your question is, how are men going to vote? And you want all men. So you'd want to pull a sample that is, 51, 49. Or if you're wondering how people are going to vote based on income, you'd want to break your sample down by income. Or if you're concerned, also, of course, you want to include religion, because religion affects how people vote. So ideally, and this would become very complicated, you'd want your sample to have all those factors in it. So again, suppose Elizabeth Warren has hired you to be her Florida data person, and you're setting up your sampling. You'd want to find out, okay, what percentage of Democrats are women, and what percentage are men? What percentage are of each, religion? And you want to have those in there. Then you want to have the income breakdown, and then you want to have ethnicity, and then education level, and then you keep, putting in factors that are relevant, which can be quite complicated because you got to know which factors are relevant, how they break down in the population, and you want to put them all into your sample to make sure you get all those people. So to the degree that your sample is a little miniature version of your whole population, the better the argument. So in a way, an ideal sample, again, would look identical. It'd be like a shrunk down version of the whole population. It would look exactly the same. So if the population is 51% women, your sample would be 51% women. If the sample is 3% of the target is, say 3% Muslims, you want your sample to be 3% Muslim. If your population is 1% super rich, you'd want your sample to have 1% super rich, and so on for all relevant factors, which can be tough to do. So how do we build these samples? Well, the usual thing, which is kind of standard in sciencey stuff, is what's called a random sample, which is exactly what it sounds like. Because as you might imagine, trying to go through the whole population and find, well, it's easy to, no, actually it's not super easy, but it's easier to get, like half men, half males, half females. And then it gets more complicated if you want to include non-traditional genders, etc. Then it becomes more complicated because you have the awkward thing of like asking people like what they are, which becomes kind of morally problematic. And so yeah, sampling can be tough. So what's a way to do without having to get in and put all the super effort into finding all those things? Well, the easy way to do it is this: random. Now, ideally, in a perfect ideal random scenario, here's how it would work. A perfectly random sample means that every member of the population has an equal chance to be selected. To use a simplified example, suppose I wanted to do a random sample of all my students, and say I've got 100 students. The way the system would need to work is that every student has a 1 in 100 chance of being selected, same exact chance. Now, in some cases, that can be done pretty easily. For example, if for some reason I wanted to do, a sample of 100 students, and I wanted a sample of 10 for whatever reason, I could just have I could use like dice, percentile dice, which generate a number from 1 to 100, and just email that student, like, what do you think about this? And that'd be fairly easy because, it's a small group, and I could pretty easily find, hopefully, at least 10 people who would answer one question. Now, as you get a bigger population, of course, it becomes a bit tougher. So, take Florida, millions of people. How do you guarantee that you could select, everybody has an equal chance? And you're probably not going to get that, because if you use a phone, well, there are a few people who don't have phones. And then most people who have phones now, when they see a number they don't recognize, they just ignore it, because Most calls are now robocalls. I don't even answer my phone anymore. I just wait for the voicemail, which is kind of bad, but I got to the point now, it's like, I don't know who's calling me, unless I recognize the number. Probably some robocall, trying to sell me some crap or scam me or give me to vote for somebody. And if you use like the web and you ask people to go there and do it, again, you need people who are going to see that advertisement, they're willing to take the time to do it. So getting a random sample can be pretty tough. And realistically, we probably never get a perfectly random sample because of all those factors. But again, the ideal is you try to do it randomly. Now, a random sample avoids bias almost by definition, at least in theory. Why? Well, a biased sample is one that doesn't represent the population, or in terms of sampling, it would be one in which every member doesn't have the same chance of being selected. And that would be a biased way of sampling. So for example, if you were doing a survey only using landlines, that of course would be biased, because you'd only get people who have landlines. It'd leave everyone else who doesn't have them. And a lot of people now don't have them, because why? Why bother? Or if you just did it through, put it out on Twitter. It would just be people who use Twitter and who are willing to do such samples, such surveys. And so bias can be hard to avoid. Now, let's suppose you're able to somehow do it truly randomly. Well, again, like in some cases. In the case of, if I was just took students and generated random numbers to survey people, that would be doable. Now, even then, a sample can still be off, cannot be representative. Why? Well, by random chance, there's a chance you could sample in a way that doesn't match your whole population. And I'll use an example like this. Let's say the population roughly breaks down 50% male, 50% female. Now, if I pull out 10 people at random, ideally, of course, I'd want, 50-50, but what could happen is, by pure chance, I might end up with, in my sample of 10, 6 male, 4 female. Or maybe way off. It may be, it's not impossible to end up with, say, 9 males, 1 female, just by pure chance. And so even if you do the sample randomly, you can, just by random chance, end up with a sample that's way off. Again, it becomes less likely if it's random, but not impossible. I mean, that you could have 10, all male or all female, just by pure chance. Now, to solve that problem, what people do, if you take statistics, there's all kinds of techniques for this. One is, the book weirdly doesn't mention it, is what's called a stratified sample. And what you do is you identify the strata, the groups, in your population, and instead of doing random from the whole population, you pull randomly from those groups. So for example, if we were doing, wanted to know what males and females think on an issue, then we would make sure we got randomly from people identified as male, people identified as female, so that way we still suffer from the problem of randomness, but at least we wouldn't end up with 10-0. We would end up with, say 5-5. And so kind of the fix is stratify. And that of course has problems as well, because again, if you're pulling out a strata, it can still end up with, results that don't match the general population. So within the strata of, say, males, there might be people who really like sports, and people who hate sports, and by pure chance, you might get people who just hate sports. So that would throw off the results of, say, sports survey, or any other quality you're looking at. So the gist of it is, always tough. Now, to deal with these problems, we have some concepts. Before concepting, though, anything about randomness that needs any more stuff? Now, because of all the problems with sampling and randomness and so on, people have developed concepts to deal with this. And these are error margin, or sometimes called margin of error, and confidence level. The error margin, or margin of error, is this. It's expressed, we've all seen this in surveys, as plus or minus a certain percentage. And what it is this. It is hopefully a calculation of how much your sample is likely to deviate from your population. Basically it's saying, this is how much I'm probably off. Now, why is there going to be margin of error? Well, we've seen the reasons. Because even if you pull randomly, there's a chance you'll get a non-representative sample. Again, if you just go by division of, say, people identify as male, people identify as female, and it's, say, 50-50, you could pull out, 10 males or 10 females just by chance. And if you stratify it, the problem still remains. So there's always a chance your sample won't be like your target. And so what they do is they factor in that. What is the deviance of your sample from your whole population? How much you're likely to be off. Now the confidence level is a fancy term for exactly what it sounds like. Namely, what is the likelihood that your sample is going to match your target? Now, the confidence level and error margin and sample size all kind of fit together. You can think of them as kind of like linked like sliders. Like when you move one of them, you can adjust the others. For example, the bigger your sample gets, the lower your error margin or margin of error goes. Why? Well, in a way you can look at this quite literally, because as your sample expands, you can kind of draw it like within the population. As it expands, you have less of a gap between your sample and the whole population, because it includes more and more. And of course, if you expand your sample to 100%, then there's no difference between your sample and your population. You could still be wrong, because people may lie, people may change their mind, etc. But in that case, your sample would be as representative as it could get, because it is everybody. There would be no margin of error, because there's no gap between your sample and the target. So the margin of error, basically, kind of drawn out metaphorically speaking, it's the gap between your sample and the whole population. And the smaller the gap gets, the smaller your margin of error gets, because you cover less and less. To use like a metaphorical example, if you're an explorer and you're looking at like a terrain to see what it's like, and you look at one part and say, whoop, there's a lot of forest, it's all forest. Well, the more you look, the more likely you are to be right. If you look at the whole area, then you're going to be right. So if you look and it's all forest, and you look at all of it, you can be really confident that it's all forest. So sample size grows, margin of error drops. Now, how does the error margin, it always sounds awkward to say, and confidence level go together? Well, you can increase your confidence level by increasing your margin of error. But as you might imagine, this can become silly. And I'll illustrate with a silly illustration. Let's say I increase my margin of error to 50, plus or minus 50%. That means my sample is off either 50 high or 50 low. Now in that case, I could have 100% confidence in any sample. For example, 50% of Florida voters, plus or minus 50%, will vote for Elizabeth Warren. That's 100% true. I can't be wrong. There's going to be somewhere between nobody and everybody. I could say 50% plus or minus 50% of all Americans favor gun control. 50% of all Americans plus or minus 50% oppose gun control. And so everything I say is true, but as you might imagine, that is useless. It is the most obvious of the obvious. So the bigger your margin of error gets, the less useful what you're saying is. Which is why they try to keep it down to a non-stupid level. So how do you know what's a stupid level and what's not? Well, one obvious thing, of course, is if everything you say is true just because of the margin of error, then yeah, that's probably useless, because you're just right because what you're saying doesn't say anything. So what's kind of the gold standard in professional surveying sampling? Well, the experts have agreed at a confidence level of 95. What does that mean? Well, it means if you do 100 surveys, like that one, 95 of them will give a true conclusion. And so that would be really extremely good. So your strength would be like 95% chance of being right, which would be really, really good. Then you might say, why not push for 100? Well, the answer is, of course, that would be deduction, so no. Then you might say, why not push for 99? Well, the problem is this. We turn to our exciting chart. Before going to our, well, actually the chart is already there. But before talking about our exciting chart, anything about margin of error needs stuff. Okay. So what does this handy chart show? Well, what it shows is this. In order to get a confidence level of 95, that's to say if you did 100 of these samples, you'd get the conclusion right 95 times out of 100. Here's what you need to do. If you have a really small sample, 10 whatevers, 10 people, we'll go with people. Your margin of error, and this assumes, to put a context for it, this assumes your target population is large, 10,000 plus. Interestingly, once you get to a big population, 10,000 plus, you don't really have to adjust your sample size beyond that. So if your population is 10,000 or 10 million or 100 million, so far it seems to work with these numbers, just because of the way large numbers work. There's math stuff in there. So you could use, for example, like FAMU, large population. Or you could use Tallahassee, large population, all of Florida, all of the US. So suppose you wondered how, go back to example, Elizabeth Warren has hired you to be her data person for Florida. And if you poll 10 people, how would you get a confidence level of 95? Well, you need to put on a margin of error of plus or minus 30. And that would be pretty not useful. So, for example, suppose you talk to 10 people, hey, will you vote for Elizabeth Warren in the primaries? Are you a registered voter? Are you a Democrat? Do you vote for Elizabeth? And suppose you get 4 people who say, yes, I will back Elizabeth Warren. Well, since your margin of error is plus or minus 30, that could be, you could be way off. It could be that 70% of people would back her, or 10%. So not, it's better than zero than nothing, but not very useful, because it's such a huge margin of error, 60 percentage points. Now, if you boost it to 25, there's a pretty rapid drop. It goes to plus or minus 22. Still, really big range. Bring it to 50, goes to plus or minus 14. Then when you get to 100, it goes to plus or minus 10. Still pretty big, but far more useful. And then, interesting, or perhaps boring things happen. Once you get to 250, plus or minus 6%, and then at 500, you get plus or minus 4. Now at this point, what happens is you get very little improvement in return for adding vast numbers of people or whatever you're sampling. So as we can see here, if you go from 10 to 100, you get a pretty good improvement. You get down to a 20% margin of error just by adding 90 people. When you get to 250, you get a pretty good improvement by adding 150 people, not as good, but now we can see that you add 250 people, you just get 2, plus or minus points. Then if you add another 500, you just improve it to plus or minus 3. You add another 500, you get a pretty small improvement. So what this shows, interestingly enough, is that you get far less for far more. So right about in this area, it becomes, in a way, cost prohibitive. You have to get so many more, say, people to get such a small improvement. Which is why, typically, when you see professional grade polls, they're typically here for sort of like preliminary, you know, ±4, and then it's sort of like, you know, professional level, national level grade would be about here. And the reason why is because it costs so much more to get a slight improvement. So it makes sense if you have the resources to get up to about 500 or ideally 1,000, but beyond that, you're paying so much more in terms of like time and resources, it becomes, you know, cost prohibitive because you just get a little more accuracy for a lot more cost. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, if you're conducting surveys, you want to make them big, and this of course assumes a properly conducted sample. Also, from the standpoint of being a consumer of surveys, you'd want to notice how big is the sample and look at the margin of error to see if the results mean anything. One that happens is, you know, always has occurred, but occurs now even more so with like the web, is there'll be all these articles about startling scientific findings or startling surveys. For example, you can make almost anything seem, you know, important or relevant or, you know, causal connection we'll see in the future by using a very small sample. So for example, there may be an article saying, you know, people ate chocolate and lost weight. And first I'll think, of course, that's BS because consuming calories doesn't make you lose weight because, you know, it's math. And then I'll look at the sample size. And so if you look at a sample size of like 25 people, well, that sample has a huge margin of error. So not very, very useful. So many of the sort of startling findings about, you know, claiming that people do something ridiculous or absurd, you'll often find that, especially in the social sciences, that's a tiny sample. And so the problem is that it may be a headline or eyeball-grabbing result, shocking and startling, but if you look at the actual size of the sample, it's useless. Now we'll see more of this in the future. So for example, looking up, I look up stuff because I run, and of course I'm running a long time, so my legs are just held together by scar tissue and unfocused rage. And so I'm always trying to find stuff, okay, how do I like make my legs, you know, not so terrible? And I'll go and look at, you know, studies and stuff conducted about things like glucosamine and, you know, zinc and stuff. And I'll look and see a study, you know, study conducted shows, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I'll look at the size, it's like, ooh, 10 people. Oh, that's, you know, and that's useless because the margin of error is so huge, you can't really get anything from it. So the takeaway from a practical standpoint is being a consumer of surveys, and this will be especially important when we talk about, you know, causal reasoning. If the sample is small, the margin of error is going to be so huge, it often makes the results utterly meaningless. So one way they get kind of shocking results is they can kind of get a sample that gets a shocking result, but it can be entirely meaningless, entirely insignificant. And so if you want to have a good critical thinking skill for checking samples, look at the sample size. Look at the result they say, look at the margin of error. And usually the margin of error is so huge, the results are meaningless. Shocking, but meaninglessly shocking. Okay, so next time, more exciting chart, because everybody loves charts.